Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Lair. I'm the director of the Human Rights Initiative at CSIS, and I apologize for the slightly late start. I'm really delighted to host this panel today. It's focused on the critical issue of how COVID-19 has a disproportionate impact on the rights of women and girls, and it's really eroding progress on a whole range of rights, including increased gender-based violence, trafficking, impacts on reproductive health, education, and their economic opportunities. A lot of evidence suggests that healthy, educated women are really vital for flourishing societies and economies. So the situation really should concern everyone. However, what we found is that media coverage is sporadic and policy attention rarely focuses just on women and girls in the COVID context. This panel is intended to enhance a more nuanced understanding of the impacts on women and girls around the world, and importantly, potential policy solutions that the new administration could implement. I'll hand over in a moment to Sohini Chatterjee, who will moderate the discussion. But first, I'll introduce her and the panelists. Sohini is a senior associate at CSIS, and I'm happy to say she was just appointed senior policy advisor at the US Department of State. She's on the faculty at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and she serves as a legal advisor for independent international legal advocates. Diana Arango is a senior gender-based violence and development specialist at the World Bank. She has more than 10 years of experience working on development, including gender-based violence in the context of humanitarian settings. Carla Capel is a senior advisor in Georgetown School of Foreign Service and a distinguished fellow with the Georgetown University Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. I was previously a vice president at USIP. Mark Lagan is Chief Policy Officer at Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, and teaches at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He's the former president of Freedom House and the former ambassador at large to counter trafficking in persons. And last but not least, Farina Winder is Senior Manager for Global Partnerships and Strategic Engagement of Family Planning 2020, which is hosted by the UN Foundation, and previously spent 6 years at the US Department of State. In addition to following the work of the experts on this panel, who all are really focused on these key issues, if you do want to learn more about this set of topics, you may also wish to follow the work of my colleagues in CSIS's Global Health Policy Center. Their research is focused on the impact of COVID on girls and women in sub-Saharan Africa. This, just for a bit of housekeeping, this conversation will be available after the fact on CSIS's webpage. And on that note, Sohini, I'd love to just turn this over to your expert hands. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks so much to the CSIS Human Rights Initiative for taking this on and elevating this really critical but neglected issue in the discourse. As Amy mentioned, over the last year, we've seen that COVID-19 has led to rather extraordinary and drastic actions by a number of governments and businesses throughout the globe, both to protect global health and also to mitigate against the spread of the infection. The question that we want to look at is sort of how those actions have affected women and girls in particular, which, as Amy mentioned, is a largely neglected issue. The economic effects on women and girls have really been devastating. And the McKinsey Global Institute recently estimated that the stalled progress on gender equity could potentially cost the global economy in the trillions of dollars. We've seen also, because of the collateral effects of COVID-19, the dismantling of decades of progress on rights. Back in April, the United Nations sort of warned us about this burgeoning shadow pandemic of violence against women and girls, which really is taking place largely sort of in the shadows behind closed doors. So we're going to delve into that issue as well. We're also going to look at sort of the critical gendered aspects of access to health services for women and girls, which again is something that is really critical and that has largely been neglected in the discourse to date. On a personal note, I just want to say that I've known a number of our panelists and had the real honor of working alongside them. They are steadfast champions of this issue and have been really devoted and committed to the cause of elevating the rights of women and girls in even the most challenging of contexts. So they have inspired me, and I think will continue to inspire me with their work. On that note, I want to kick off with my first question to Carla Capel. Carla, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the scope of the pandemic and its gender dynamics. Specifically, how has it affected women and men differently?
Thanks, Sohini. And first, let me say thank you for organizing the conversation. And it's a wonderful group of people, most of whom I've known for a long time and admired their work. So first of all, the broader context. We're now approaching 100 million cases worldwide. We've already seen over 2 million deaths in 188 countries. The highest mortality rates we see in the US, Brazil, India, and Mexico. But mortality doesn't really tell the whole story in any way, shape, or form with regard to this pandemic, both in terms of its health consequences, because we know that for a significant number of people who have suffered the disease, there are long-term health consequences, also for the psychological consequences and the consequences for economies and societies. I'm pleased that you asked me about the gendered implications or dynamics of the pandemic itself, because it really presents, in some ways, a perfect case study in why paying attention to gendered issues and gender dynamics within societies is absolutely essential to progress. Why is that the case with regard to COVID-19? Well, first of all, we know that women and men play very different roles in the home, in communities, and in societies. And so the care burden, when you talk about a health crisis, falls disproportionately on women. We know that men and women hold different jobs in societies in general. Over 70% of health and social sector workers are female. Women make up some 75% of low-paid and unpaid laborers. We also know that women and men in general face differing degrees of vulnerability to things like issues like trafficking and gender-based violence, which I know other of our speakers will be talking about in a few minutes. And so men and women move differently in society, and that has really important implications for the way we respond and the implications of that response for the return to normalcy and the return to well-being that we saw before the outbreak of the pandemic.
Thanks so much, Carla. As a sort of follow-up to that, I wondered, could you talk a little bit about some of the key sectoral implications for women and girls based on the emerging trends that we've been seeing, and what you just articulated, actually? I mean, what kind of specific setbacks are you looking at sort of in terms of what women and girls are facing? Are there sort of any particular economic, social, or political setbacks that we need to be particularly cognizant of?
Sure, there are many, and I'll give some data, and I'll give you broader contours. So first, it's important to say that we believe that men are the larger share of those who are seriously afflicted by the disease, and that they are the larger share of those who die. That's not necessarily indicative of the larger share of infections, and frankly, though the data and the disaggregated data is a little unreliable and spotty, we believe that women are likely to bear more of the infections because they are in more of those frontline health-related roles, whether that is child and elder care or whether that is healthcare services. But so I want to start with that frame. But when we look, for example, at unemployment, you cited the McKinsey study in your introduction, and the McKinsey study estimated early on that women were 1.8 times more vulnerable to unemployment than were men because of their where they're situated within economies and societies. And we see that playing out in real time. And let me give you just the example of the United States. So in the United States, 55% of those who have lost their jobs have been women, so a disproportionate share. However, that percentage does not even take into consideration the more than 2 million women who have stepped out of the job market entirely to take care of elders or children or to assume other responsibilities. So we see a very disproportionate impact. And in fact, in December, in the United States, women made up 111% of job losses. You might say, how can it be more than 100%? Well, that's because men's jobs came back online, whereas women continued to hemorrhage jobs. So 100% of the losses and 111% of net losses in that month were female. And we see this repeated around the world. When we look at soaring rates of gender-based violence, and we'll hear more about this in detail, we see very disproportionate impacts for women. We knew that before the pandemic, it was 1 in 5 women, 20% around the world, and we know that that is higher, and we'll hear more about that. When we talk about education, it's interesting because it's in some ways a mixed bag when you look around the world. Girls in many places are more vulnerable to reductions in education. They have less access to computers and less computer literacy. So when we go to digital learning, they're more vulnerable. They bear more of the household burden. And so they both have to split their time between household chores to a larger extent, and they're more likely to be withdrawn from school when crisis strikes and the home burden increases. They're also vulnerable to being withdrawn from school for early marriage, particularly when the economic burden increases and there's a need to generate capital. But we do see that, for example, in Ecuador, women's housework and both housework and studying have increased. At the same time, in Ethiopia and Peru and Vietnam, we've seen different trends. It's been actually better for girls than it has been for boys. In Thailand, the increase in housework has been tremendously larger for girls, with implications for time studying. And in the Philippines, actually, the mental health crisis is taking a huge toll on women's education, particularly at the tertiary level. And it's a perfect encapsulation of why we do need to look at how boys and girls move differently within societies. We know that there are over 5 million girls at risk of losing education. And it's important to note that we start from a much lower baseline. So we're losing larger percentage of the girls who are enrolled, even if we know that the implications for education play out differently in different parts of the world. So I will, and then you asked about politics. And I think the implications for politics and for leadership are really important, because what we've seen is, notwithstanding the expertise that women bring with regard, given their position in economies and societies, they have been largely marginalized in discussions around policymaking, and that it has placed them on the sidelines often in the response. And so I will wrap up by saying that I think we need to think about both the needs, opportunities, and obligations we have to women and girls on 3 levels. We need to deal with their specific vulnerabilities. We need to make sure that we are elevating their voice because they bring distinct expertise. And we need to make sure that we're thinking about how we prevent retrenchment and permanent losses in the status of women and girls, because that's the risk we face. And to finish with that McKinsey report that you cited, if we don't, as a global community, deal with the issues for women and girls, we risk foregoing $13 trillion in well-being for all of us, not just those women and girls, but for everybody in societies around the world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Carla. I want to sort of delve into this gender-based violence issue and turn now to Diana, who I know works quite a lot in this space. Diana, can you tell us a little bit about how COVID has affected gender-based violence, in particular, talk about intimate partner violence as well as violence against children?
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with all of you. and to talk a little bit about a co-occurring pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is violence against women and girls. And this pandemic, as Carla noted, existed well before the COVID-19 pandemic, but has been exacerbated by this pandemic. And sadly, it will continue to exist well after we've dealt with this pandemic, because we know how long it takes to change the social norms and the root causes and the risk factors for violence that women and girls experience. Just to give you a sense of the pandemic before COVID-19 came on the scene, Carla mentioned 1 out of 5. The WHO tells us that 33% of women, or 1 out of 3 women, will experience either violence from an intimate partner or sexual violence from a non-partner. So that really is almost 1 billion women and girls globally. That's the population of all of sub-Saharan Africa, just as a comparison point for us. And so now we see that these 33% of women might be experiencing increased levels of violence, but also other women that were not experiencing violence are also at risk of experiencing violence for the first time. So we're not just seeing increase in the global prevalence, but we're also seeing increases in the intensity and the types of violence that women and girls are experiencing, with adolescent girls being at heightened risk. So how do we know this? CGD, Amber Peterman and Megan O'Donnell have done 3 literature roundups reviews, and so far they've been able to compile 74 studies that use different methodologies, qualitative methodologies, some phone surveys, some looking at increases in access to services, increase in call line dials by women and girls. So with those different methodologies around the world, we are seeing an increase in both violence against women and violence against women and violence against children more broadly. Now, the World Bank had the opportunity to include in one of its surveys in Indonesia around economic participation of women, some questions around perceptions of violence in Indonesia. And I say this because I want to note that it's really difficult to follow the WHO ethical and safety standards of doing research on violence against women in COVID-19 situation, where we're not able to interview women face to face, where we're not able to control the environment that they're in when they're responding to these questions. So we were able to very safely kind of design some proxy questions in our Indonesia study. And we saw in that study in particular that women are reporting feeling unsafe in the community, unsafe at home, and unsafe in moving in their communities. So feeling more exposed to harassment. They're seeing they're reporting a perception of increased conflict in the community and at home. And what we did find also with that study, where we had the opportunity to ask about women's economic participation, is that women who were employed were less at risk of perception of increased insecurity and increased risk of violence, both in home and in the community, which is interesting. And so that is really in relation to intimate partner violence. We know around other pandemics like Ebola that other forms of violence can increase that affect women and girls. And this is in relation to what Carla said, that the majority of healthcare workers are women. We're seeing violence anecdotally. We don't have a lot of data on this, but violence targeting health workers, even within their own homes, women getting killed because they are working in the COVID-19 pandemic and their families don't want to be exposed to this deadly pandemic. So unfortunately, homicide has increased, femicide has increased of these women. And we're also really at this point, especially the bank, looking at, now that we're gearing up to expand access to COVID-19 vaccinations, how are we going to safeguard and protect women from the sexual exploitation and abuse that happens in exchange for access to vaccination? So those are all different forms of violence against women that are happening right now, that have happened in past pandemics, that have happened before this pandemic, will happen after the pandemic, and that we really have to look at and be aware of when we're taking policy decisions.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's a sobering sort of portrait, but really important. I want to turn now to Verena and ask you a question sort of about global health. Can you talk a little bit about the pandemic, sort of the impact of the shadow pandemic and the collateral effects on women and children in sort of the sexual and reproductive health and rights space, as well as with respect to family planning services? Sort of tell us a little bit about the scope, and also kind of why does it matter, and what have the responses looked like to date?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Sohini, and thank you to Amy and to Sohini for shining a light on this. I can think of no better way to spend the first full day of this new administration than with these esteemed colleagues. So I'm really happy to be here today. I think what is so striking as I listen to Carla and to Diana talk is thinking back now almost a year ago when it became clear that this was going to be a global pandemic, and the sense that it was actually going to affect everybody, and the sense, at least in the beginning, that this could potentially be a great equalizer in many ways. And of course, here we are a year later, and as Carla said, the effects could not be more gendered. In a way, COVID has really been a global stress test, and we're failing. We're especially failing the women and girls who had the least to lose, to start with, women and girls who had the fewest social protections. So you asked about impact and a little bit about response. So specifically to family planning and sexual and reproductive health, I think we're failing the stress test in at least two ways. In the response side, I think that there's some measured reason for hope beyond the pandemic. So of course, the first undeniable impact is on the global health system itself and on health systems designed specifically to address the needs of women and girls. Carla mentioned COVID deaths have been covered by media more and have been disproportionately male. But we should all be concerned about the disruption to life-saving, essential, critical healthcare for women and girls, which includes, of course, contraception. Family planning is essential. It's time-sensitive. It's life-saving care that remains critical, especially in a crisis. And we've seen disruptions to this access due to lockdowns, curfews, clinic closures, disrupted supply chains, which meant that commodities haven't gotten to the shelves where women need them. And because of this, we're going to see knock-on effects like unintended pregnancies, unsafe abortions, maternal deaths. We're also going to see knock-on effects on broader gender equality measures. We've already seen in some of our own data and the data of some of our partners, an increase in food insecurity. We're going to see, as Carla mentioned, school dropouts, girls not returning to school. As Diana mentioned, what the SG called at the beginning of all of this, the Secretary General called the shadow pandemic, GBV, even though we don't have that concrete data just yet, we know it is increasing. And we're going to talk, I think, a lot more about the impact on caregiving and labor markets. We're seeing that play out everywhere. So that's kind of the first big, broad impact. The second, and I know that Diana will likely speak more to this, I do think it's important to underline how we don't actually know how this is going to play out in its entirety just yet, because we don't yet have the data. We need that sex disaggregated data, and in many countries that doesn't exist. In family planning, and my organization, FP 2020, has been engaged in data and data collection, and we run a series of core indicators that we publish every year specific to family planning. We've been deeply engaged in this, and so we have some limited data, but even that data has been disrupted. The DHS, the mix have all been suspended during the pandemic for safety measures. So we won't know for quite some time what the true impact has been in terms of the disruption. We do know there was a global pulse survey from the WHO this past August, I believe, that said that family planning is one of the most, it's actually the second most disrupted health service behind only routine immunizations. And we have some data from private service providers like MSI and IPPF that indicate that visits to their services have decreased. And particularly from IPPF has shown that that disproportionate decrease is coming really from adolescents and young people. These are the people who are going to be hit the hardest and for the longest. So I think those are kind of the two big broad impacts. In terms of response, and I know that we'll talk more about this over the course of this panel, there are some concrete things that I think, or that I hope will outlast COVID, specific to family planning and our adaptations to that at the highest level. I remember back in April, UNFPA came out with estimates that up to 47 million women might lose access to contraception as a result of the pandemic. To put that in context, we started at a baseline. This is Guttmacher data, 218 million women who have an unmet need for contraception, or they wish to avoid pregnancy but are not using a modern method. That worst case scenario has largely not come to pass. And that has really, I think, largely to do with the fact that the global family planning community came together early. They came together very quickly. The WHO put out guidance about how to safely adapt programs. Country governments, India, Kenya, Senegal, Tanzania, many others have made some really concrete and specific adjustments to service delivery. MSI, IPPF have made adjustments. And of course, women have been able to coalesce and demand for family planning in ways that suit them. Those are the kinds of things that I hope we'll continue to see. But of course, those two big impacts loom large.
Thank you so much, Verena. I want to turn to Mark, because I know, Mark, you're a chief policy officer at a global health organization now, and I wondered if you had anything to add to Verena's remarks in terms of how the sort of pandemic has affected health for women and girls.
Well, thanks for asking, and I really have extremely high regard for Verena's work in this area. One might say there are 4 E's that we should be concerned about with respect to women and girls: education, economic and opportunity, employment, and entrepreneurship. And under normal circumstances, pre-COVID, those are all very hard to achieve as enablers of women's and girls' ability to thrive if they don't have access to healthcare. In particular, the ability to time and space having children has an enormous impact on women's ability to thrive economically. In comes COVID-19 and makes it even harder on many fronts in the ways on reproductive health that Verena refers to. But I work for an organization that focuses on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and the work of the Global Fund. I've seen enormous disruption of the ability to reach those most in need, marginalized people, and it's heavily gendered. And so that's a big consideration. If women do not have access to clinics, ability to have the care they need, and a voice in how health services are governed as participants in the political system and civil society, they're disproportionately harmed.
Thanks, Mark. Amy mentioned this in her introduction, but I know you are also the U.S. ambassador at large to combat trafficking in person. So I wondered, do you have any thoughts on how the pandemic has affected trafficking in women and children?
So I have a kind of similar answer. That the situation for women and girls was already in a bad situation. If you look at it, that there have been estimates that over 70% of the victims and survivors of human trafficking, either for sexual exploitation or for labor exploitation, are female. Of those, some estimates run as high as 99% of the victims of sex trafficking being female. and a good 58% being female, whether in factories, agriculture, domestic servitude, and so on. Women are generally much more subject to poverty, even pre-COVID. And so the enabling environment, the kind of desperation or will to take risks that allow people to be lured into the force, fraud, and coercion situations of human trafficking increase. And if there's, a gender gap, and there's a gender gap for the age cohort of females 25 to 34, it's been accelerated, and the kinds of things that Carla has raised indicate that. If you have job insecurity, it becomes more insecure. You're subject to more possibility of human trafficking.
Thanks, Mark. I guess, quickly, I wanted to ask you, as the former president of Freedom House, if you had any, comments to add to what Carla has already said in terms of the political participation, the sort of effects on women's leadership in the civil society sector. And actually, as a kind of second question that I want to ask you, but then I want to ask all the panelists, maybe we can pivot at this point to talking about also what are some suggested recommendations that you have in terms of how can we mitigate the consequences of these collateral effects to avoid some of what we've talked about, and also how can we sort of build back better? What are some steps that we can take to build in resiliencies and to really elevate the rights of women and girls looking forward?
Well, just quickly to look at the realm of political participation in civil society, those are extremely important for shaping outcomes, shaping health services, shaping governance, especially post-conflict situations. When females disproportionately bear the burden of care for family members in homes, losing their employment, their space for devoting time to being leaders in civil society and political realm is increased, and already existing discrimination is boosted. If you'd like me to go straight into some policy recommendations, first I co-authored an article with Sohini Chatterjee in Foreign Policy in October called "Why Inclusion is Important for U.S. Foreign Policy." And we make a couple of recommendations. One is that the new Biden administration, its first 100 days, should launch a new National Security Council task force on gender equality and focus on these COVID impacts. There's already been an announcement of an interagency gender task force in the works for the new administration. Our second proposal is there needs to be a cross-sectoral fund dedicated to reversing the catastrophic effects of COVID-19, in particular targeting funds for that spiking gender-based violence phenomenon that Diana and others mentioned. Just quickly, my organization, Friends of the Global Fight, put out a paper in October also on the impact of COVID-19 on adolescent girls and young women. And its recommendations were, don't forget to address inequalities that relate to gender norms in societies, expand programs supporting adolescent girls' health and economic empowerment, and to think of them as mutually reinforcing than the causal arrow going one way or the other between health and economic empowerment. And we need to scale programs in which women have voice and participation in decision-making roles. The Global Fund tries to advance that in the Voice of Women on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria programs. We need an integrated approach of all forms of health so that you screen for problems like HIV/AIDS while you're looking for other things, and vice versa. But it is important in the US policy assets not to dilute those things that are effective as you move in the holistic direction. Let's have PEPFAR be as strong as possible on HIV/AIDS as we integrate a more holistic approach. This will help women, and you don't want to lose the positive impact. A woman can't thrive if she's going to perish from AIDS, TB, or malaria, or COVID.
Thanks so much, Mark. And sort of turning to you, Carla, for some version of that same question. You talked about some of the statistics in terms of if we don't take steps to mitigate the consequences, there's huge sort of disastrous effects on the global economy writ large. What steps do you suggest we take, that both for this administration, but sort of in general in terms of building back better?
So first of all, I really enjoyed hearing everybody's remarks, and I wanted to pick up on pieces of what Mark and Verena said and thinking about the responses, because I think the responses, there are multiple baskets, but there are the structural issues and adjustments that need to be made to improve the way we deal with times of crisis. And then there are the issues of norms, and we can't forget those issues because we kind of always go back to zero unless we change the way societies are doing business. So what I mean is, for example, you can put in place policies that increase workplace flexibility. For example, we all know we're much more flexible than we thought we were before we started working from home for months and months and doing Zoom panels like this. However, we also need to recognize that that doesn't solve the problem or the challenge that's posed by increased female caregiver burden, because those relate to norms. So everybody is working from home, but often it is the woman who is bearing more responsibility for elderly people who are afflicted with the disease or kids who are home from school. And so our policy responses need to bear that in mind, and they need to help move the needle in terms of how responsibility is divided up. So, for example, if we're offering leave for family care, maybe that leave when you have a new child needs to be prescribed for men and for women, not a flexible pool of leave. Because if you leave a flexible pool of leave, the vast majority of it is taken by women, and we don't shift the norms. And we see that if we do create incentives to distribute that kind of labor, then we do see shifts in norms. The same is true with regard to the economic protections that we put in place for low and unpaid labor, and thinking about what are the sectors in which we are creating more of a market, where is our care economy put in place, and how do we ensure that it is assisting women as equitably as it is assisting men. More broadly, we need to think about the proper role of social protection. And it gets back to Verena's point about the resilience of systems within societies, and thinking about how we don't end up with the kinds of interruptions to service that we're facing now. Our delivery mechanisms for things like contraception and information about family planning and health services more broadly, and how we make sure that we are putting in place tactics and strategies and hard physical resources that make sure that the pipelines don't get cut off quite so easily. So I think there are many specific interventions we can deal with and talk about, and I hope that we do. But I urge us all, and I urge those who are listening, not to forget about fundamentally the need that we have to change norms to create greater egalitarianism when we're responding to crisis like this across the board.
Thanks so much, Carla. And Verena, sort of to you, I wonder if you could respond from the sort of sexual and reproductive health and rights space, as well as the family planning. What can we do to sort of build back better and build in those resiliencies that you mentioned?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to really echo Carla's comments about thinking about both the structural changes as well as the norm changes. And I also want to pick up on something that Mark said about integrating health systems, and specifically the potential opportunities that lie ahead with some of our largest global health programs, specifically PEPFAR. For global health security, especially broadly, and especially as it interacts and intersects with gender, I want to call attention to the work of Rupa Dutt and her team at Women in Global Health. They've put together a really comprehensive package. They've been doing just phenomenal work throughout COVID, but they've put together 5 specific recommendations that speak exactly to this theme. And just paraphrasing really at a very high level, 2 of the biggest asks are about leadership, ensuring that the right people are at the decision table, and that has to include the lived experiences of women, of girls, of young people. And secondly, we have to be thinking about funding too, and not just putting money out the door, but ensuring that we're marrying funding with those leaders. I think there's a data point, and this is now old, this is 2019, and I'm drawing into the recesses of my memory here, but it was something like 1% of international development funding actually goes to women-led organizations, and the sort of funding, and I think it's 1% of funding for gender projects goes to women-led organizations. That's a 1% of 1%. That's, I hope I'm paraphrasing that correctly, but it's a very, very, very small pool. Specific to family planning, I think we really have to be thinking about how we protect the system that we have and how we normalize some of the innovations that have come through at the behest of so many in this community that have come together to respond to family planning and to ensure that women and girls continue to be able to receive life-saving care. So I'm thinking about telehealth, self-care options, broadening health service delivery points, making policy changes like the UK did, investing in community health workers, relaxing prescription requirements. A lot of these things Carla talked about were more flexible than we thought that we were. That applies also to how we deliver healthcare. And so I think, and I hope that some of these things, as we look at the sort of long arm of this pandemic, will be things that we can build into our health system so that we are actually truly meeting the woman or the girl or the client where she is and ensuring that she is more empowered and more satisfied at the end of the day so that we can fill sort of the principles of rights-based family planning.
Great, thank you so much, Verena. And then Diana, I wonder if you could answer the exact same question, sort of how do you think we build back better in terms of, you had mentioned this before, there were the statistics on gender-based violence prior to COVID were staggering, but it's gotten worse and worse. So what are your recommendations and sort of in terms of next steps?
Thanks, Sohini. So the World Bank really gives all of its clients, and I think these are globally applicable recommendations, 4 kind of buckets of work that they should be prioritizing during COVID-19 to continue to address gender-based violence. And so the first one would be very in line with working on social norms. It's to continue to invest in prevention of gender-based violence. So tackling those social norms that underlie the use of violence against women as a way to maintain inequality between men and women, but also as a manifestation of the inequality between men and women. So really tackling social norms, focusing on prevention work, trying to innovate in that space. Even if it's remote parenting programs, there's a long list of interventions that we know can be implemented to address violence against women. And so investing in that, keeping that investment level up. We also want to make sure that women have access to economic opportunities. As we saw in the Indonesia study, economic opportunities and working was a protective factor in that situation. We know that COVID has caused economic stress in the household, so actually access to cash or in-kind assistance can also alleviate some of the economic stress that leads to gender-based violence. So making sure those systems are available to women, either economic opportunities or social safety nets, as was mentioned before. We also want the health sector to continue to prioritize response to survivors of violence against women. And so we see not only an opportunity to continue with that funding, because unfortunately it gets pushed down to the bottom of the list in terms of priorities when a health related pandemic like COVID-19 comes on board, continuing to keep those non-essential COVID-19 services at the top of the list continuing to have supplies of PEP, continuing to train healthcare workers on how to both recognize and provide appropriate quality response to survivors of gender-based violence should be a priority. And then finally, research. Talking about research, I think what the community that works on violence against women and girls is calling for right now is to shift our research not into understanding if COVID-19 has increased violence against women. I think we've established that, and I think our response was still not sufficient even before the pandemic. So now that we know that violence against women and girls is a problem that it is persisting through the pandemic, really focusing our research on understanding how the pandemic has affected risk factors, and more importantly, I would think, what has worked in this pandemic to address violence against women, to make sure that women have access to services, to start or to continue with prevention programming, what works, what didn't work. And actually those lessons can help us build back better and can help us prevent violence against women and girls even after we've gotten the COVID-19 pandemic under control. So starting to document that is very important.
Thanks so much, Diana. It's as I mentioned, it's a sobering portrait, but I think you have all done an outstanding job of sort of painting that portrait for us and giving it sort of a granularity and texture. And so it's really just been thrilling for me to be a part of this really esteemed group of experts and talk to you all. The effects, the collateral effects of COVID on women and girls have been profound. We see it's even more disproportionate if you look at sort of women of color and women coming from marginalized communities. So, this has been a really important discussion. I think I want to thank you all so much, and really also thank you to Amy Lair and the CSIS Human Rights Initiative for putting on this panel, for taking on this discussion, and again, elevating this really critical but largely neglected issue in the discourse.
Thanks so much, Sohini, and thanks so much to our panelists. I think some of the statistics and facts that you all presented are a little bit bleak, but I also think that's why it was so important to have the part of the discussion about policy opportunities. And I just really hope this panel brings out the fact that impacts on women and girls need special attention integrated across all the different areas you talked about, and that has to just be a key focus as we start to vaccinate and start to hopefully get the pandemic under control, that there are a lot of consequences we still need to deal with and weren't necessarily doing as well as we would have liked to even before the pandemic. I do also just I know Carla wanted to make sure we flagged the fact that we've been talking about women and girls and disproportionate impacts. If you then look at communities of color and marginalized groups, the statistics and outcomes are even worse, so they need particular specialized attention. On that note, I know we're getting at the end of our time, but just really, again, want to thank everyone on the panel and Sohini for her moderation. Thank everyone who was able to join. And I hope we see progress on these issues that are of such long-term importance to our societies. Thank you.